Well, good evening, everybody. It's so good to see you tonight, and we're going to wrap up tonight our halftime break, our holiday break. We've gone just on through, but we usually don't like to meet Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and then December is so busy for everybody, and so we just have found it better to just take a break and kind of puts a pause in this. I kind of thought at the beginning I'd just kind of hurry through the book of Revelation, but it's been kind of nice just to kind of walk through. And have you been enjoying this series? You're back again. What is it? Why do you come on Wednesday night? Other than just you come because there's church on Wednesday nights, but what is it that interests you about this topic? Can I just ask that for a minute? Yes. Yeah. Right.
But still, they taught. Oh, excuse me. They taught, how scary and how dooming it was, and how and
a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. I've had that response from several people in this. They said, I just avoid the book of Revelation because it's so scary, and if this is going to happen to us, I just, and I know why the theory of the rapture is so popular, because if that's how it's going to happen, I don't want to be around for that, the giant grasshoppers and stuff. And just fear. I'm grateful for that. I think the book of Revelation is meant to be encouraging. You believe that? Who's ever told you that before? It's supposed to be one of the most encouraging books because it's written as a prophetic work of art. That's what I call it. It's not just art, it's not just a human creation. I believe it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but you really have to understand the form of literature it is, understand what an apocalypse is and how they wrote. And that's a little bit academic. Most churches aren't going to teach this or go into this depth, but I'm a frustrated professor. I haven't figured out a place. Nobody hires middle-aged white guys. Can you imagine that? To teach in seminaries and colleges. And so I've even had somebody that was such in that bubble where they said, man, if you're a middle-aged white guy, your name goes to the bottom of the resume pile. So here I am. But sometimes I like to do oh man, it's been one of those days. I like to do cross-training. I like to, throw another piece of creativity up alongside it, like I did with the song American Pie. And if you weren't there that night, it's October 1st. Go back and watch it, because it really, I refer to a lot. And to me, it explains a lot about what an apocalypse is, how it uses metaphors and previous apocalyptic images and symbols from wars in the past, and sometimes even mixes in mythology from the different cultures to paint a picture of something. And so why not just write it like the rest of the New Testament? Why not just write it as a letter? Why not just write a history like the book of Acts? Why not just tell us this is what we're talking about? And there is a reason for that. Somebody last week says, I was always taught that John was seeing something that was so far beyond his comprehension that that's just how he could. So so in John's vision, what he's seeing is reality. And it's actually kind of the opposite. He's seeing a reality of something that happened on earth, but he's describing it in apocalyptic language. And so I wanted to throw something up. Tim, do you know how to turn the light down? Like the house lights down just for a moment. Has everybody ever seen this painting? So this is a painting by Claude Monet, and it's called, I don't speak French, so this is my best, Impression Soleil Levant, which means impression sunrise. And so now art had gone, from all throughout the Renaissance and the different periods, it had gone through a bunch of transitions. This is the art history major in me coming out. But lastly, sometime in the mid-18th century, they moved from Romanticism, which was very idealized and didn't really look real. It was better than life, And then they moved to realism, where they would make paintings of simple farmers or peasants, poor people, nobody important in it. women gleaning wheat in a field, and it was more connected with the real life. And then came a group of artists in France, Claude Monet was one, that began to experiment with a new style. And they didn't know what it was called at first, but it was more simple. And so this is an impression of a sunrise. Now, is it photorealistic? No. Is it trying to be photorealistic? No. The critics that first came and saw all this stuff thought it was ridiculous. They said, that's not art. That's a sketch on the way to a painting. That's not an actual painting. And come to find out, if you owned this, you'd be very rich. But he said, it's just like expressionism. And because that was the name of this painting. So this painting is what gave rise to that phrase, expressionism. Now, so here's the art history part of it. What do you see in this picture? Can you just react? Don't pick it apart like a scientist. Just think like an artist. What are you looking at?
Riders on horses in the background?
Nope, they're not riders on horses.
Oh, it looks like.
So maybe it should be a little bit bigger. Yeah, there's boats. He said, it's not what you see, it's what you feel. That's right. So what do you see in it? What is your impression of it? What's going on in this picture? I want to be in one of those boats. What do you think they're doing this early in the morning? Because it's called sunrise. They're fishing, right? These guys are out there fishing. You can kind of tell the sun is up in the back, but so this broke so many rules. For example, in classical painting, you smooth out your brush strokes. In oil painting, you smooth them out so that you can't see the brush strokes, but you can see his brush strokes. They're all sloppy. And so that does a couple of things. One is it kind of divorces you from the reality of the scene. It's not photorealistic, but it kind of gives you the impression of it. So it's like he's not painting a picture of the bay that he's looking out of, which is where he was. He was in his apartment looking out on Le Havre Bay, one of the main bays in France. He's painting his impression of the sunrise. And now we're looking at his impression. And so it does several things. Because it's kind of divorced from the details, you can't tell what color coat that guy's wearing. And in the background, you can see the masts of some larger ships. You can also see some smokestacks on the left, some more on the right. You can see the sun, the reflection of the sun off of the water. But one of the things that this does is, because it's not so focused on the detail of it, is it adds some elements that you can't add with a still. And one of those elements is time. So what's the sun doing? Is it rising? Well, it's called sunrise. So you wait long enough, 10 minutes later, the sun's not in that same spot. So this is almost, you paint so fast, and they would often do it out in the open air rather than in a studio. But what's the water doing? What's that? It's choppy. But you see, so one of the things is when you add the element of time, the water's rippling. Can you almost see it? There's a trick that your eye does when there's just short brush strokes like that and they're not connected, is your eye does this thing where you go between them all, and it gives this illusion almost of motion. And so when I look at this is not the best way to view this. It's a lot better when it's on my screen or my computer at home. But when I look at this, I can see the water rippling, and I can see the sun reflection on the water doing this thing, like when it's reflected in water. And I can see the smoke almost going like this, billowing up in the back. I can see the guys rowing their boats. It just adds this. It's disconnected me from thinking that I have to have an accurate vision of it, and it's connecting to me with what's going on in the scene. Are you with me? This is called impressionism. When they asked Don McLean, you can turn the lights back on, Pastor Tim, thank you. They asked him to describe what style that song is that he wrote, American Pie, and he says it's expressionism. He used that phrase. He goes, I'm not writing details of what went on in the 50s and the 60s. I'm writing an impressionistic work of art. this is how it made me feel. It was like losing my childhood and my innocence, and the country was doing that. And this whole song was about the loss of the 50s and the birth of the 60s and the turmoil we're going through. An apocalypse is like that. It captures, you said the emotion, but it captures the trauma and the emotion of a generation. And so before you can decode an apocalypse or try to even guess at what some of it means, by the way, in an apocalypse, you're never supposed to figure out everything. So that can be frustrating, right? There's always some parts of it that are left mysterious. And then every once in a while, they'll throw you a breadcrumb just so you keep following, or a little Easter egg that says, like Apollyon, that was the name of the 15th Legion or something like that. And so the book of Revelation is very expressionistic, and you have to read it like that in its symbolism. You have to get in the mode of not being worried about, that is not a photorealistic picture. It's not supposed to be. And yes, that painting is done. It's completed, and it's hanging in a museum right now. And so I wanted to show you a picture I took with my phone last September. Went out with Daryl Warner on his boat. And when I see that impressionistic picture that Monet painted, I understand exactly what he means. Because I don't know if you've ever been in a situation or been at a foot of a mountain or been someplace and you thought, I'm going to take a picture of the Grand Canyon on my phone. And you get it later. Does it ever really even come close? So disappointing. I remember when I was a kid, I had a little Instamatic camera, and I was so disappointed at how bad those pictures. It's not even close. I can just tell you out here, we were out there about 5 or 6 in the morning, and there's about 3 boats in this picture, but if I could pan around like this, there were about 500. Every boat on the west coast that was fishing for salmon was in St. Helens for a couple of weeks because they had closed everything below the Lewis River. And so everywhere, you could walk from boat to boat. And this morning, there was fog that was coming up off of the water. And so you had this army of tiny ships with their little green and red lights on the front and their little white light in the back, just quietly fishing. Thousands of guys. And then I looked up, and in the clouds, the sun was just part of it. You can kind of see it, can't you? I'm going to tell you, this isn't even 1% of how awesome it was. I just stood there in awe, almost had one of those spiritual experiences where I just said, wow, this is awesome. I'm never going to forget this moment right here. I'll go out fishing again, but there's some moments you just can't capture again. You know what I mean? And so the Impressionists discovered that you can represent the emotion or the impression of a thing better by not being so focused on the details of it, by extracting the picture from the earthly perspective and putting it more in a spiritual perspective. And so the book of Revelation isn't trying to paint us a detailed picture of the first century war of the Jews and the Romans. He's given us an impressionistic view of it. He's given us a view from heaven, and everything in the book of Revelation happens in a dream. And so it's a dreamlike version of it. And so let's turn to Revelation 11, and I want to talk about this next season. The second woe, the first woe was the arrival of Apollyon, which I believe was the landing of Vespasian and 4 Roman legions, along with all the auxiliaries, which added up to about 60,000. And it descended, and the whole Galilee campaign, he calls it the first woe, was the beginning. In Jesus' Olivet discourse on the Mount of Olives, he calls it the beginning of the birth pains. It's the first part of the war. So a Jewish apocalypse is a prophetic work of symbolic art given spiritual meaning and encouragement to a traumatized generation. Somebody said, I grew up being afraid of the book of Revelation. But has anybody ever told you that? I think the book of Revelation was meant to be encouraging. It was written to 7 churches, little churches up in Asia Minor, that had already seen the Roman army come right down through there on the way to destroy Jerusalem and back up that way after the war. And so there are at least 5. There are more traumas than this in the Old Testament. But the main ones we talk about are the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Rome. If you will, if you remember Daniel's, by the way, if you like this type of stuff and are sad, my friend who's watching says, I'm so bummed that you're taking a break from the book of Revelation. So I went back and started reading your book of Daniel one, which is a lot like this, because the book of Daniel as well is apocalyptic. And it's speaking about the war with the Seleucids. Anyway, in each one of these, there's the apocalyptic literature picked up. There's some of it in Isaiah and Hosea, but in Joel and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, if you've ever tried to read, is really one of the major apocalypses that began during the time of the Babylonian exile. And then after the exile, when they returned, the book of Zechariah, which is going to get quoted in a couple of significant ways tonight, is talking about the end of the exile and the return to Israel and the rebuilding of the second temple. And so, by the way, I should have put that instead of just ends the exile. I should have said building the second temple, because a lot of these traumas have to do with the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, for them, that's the place where Yahweh dwelt. And then the Greeks, in about 165, they desecrate the temple. And so books like Daniel and Enoch, which is not in the Bible. And then lastly, it was Rome. So do you remember Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel has a vision? I should have put the statue up there, of a statue. And he can't understand what the statue is. And Daniel interprets the dreams. And he says, this statue, it has a head of gold. And so the interpretation of that, the head of gold is the Babylonians. So it starts with 1, 2. And then the arms and the shoulders of silver are the Medo-Persians. And then the waist, bronze, is the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And then the legs that are iron mixed with clay is the Seleucid kingdom, which took over after the time of Alexander. They were Greek, but it was the Seleucids. And they were the ones that tormented and desecrated the temple. And they're the ones that Hanukkah was formed after. And so after that war, the book of Daniel was written. And for about 100 years, they had self-rule, but then the Romans came in. And they took that statue dream from Daniel and they reinterpreted the whole thing. Just like Revelation is going to take Daniel and reinterpret it. And now, instead of being the Seleucids, the legs of iron mixed with clay becomes the Romans. And they recycled it. They reused it over again. But so much of the book of Revelation has to do with the coming of the Romans to destroy Jerusalem and once and for all destroy the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple, never to be rebuilt again. Now, sometime many hundreds of years later, the Muslims, the Umayyad Caliphate, rebuilt the Dome of the Rock on that same spot, not to desecrate it, to honor it. But when the Crusaders took it over, they turned it into a Christian church, and then it went back. And it's still there, but there are some of the, you'll read some end times theory that say, well, doesn't the temple have to be rebuilt in Jerusalem? I said, why would the temple be rebuilt? Well, because it's in the book of Revelation. And if you only see the book of Revelation as something in the future, then, well, I got an alternate explanation for that. That temple got destroyed in 70 AD, and we have the history of it. Revelation 11 says, questions about all of that tonight? Anybody not understand what I just said? People ask me questions afterwards. Ask it here because somebody else might have that question. Even if I told somebody last week, they said, sometimes you just completely lose me, Pastor Mike. That's okay. You don't have to remember everything I'm saying. Just jump back on the wagon when something starts making sense to you. He says, and a reed like a rod was given to me, and someone said, rise and measure God's temple and the altar and those who worship it. Revelation 11, just to skip to the chase and tell you the end of the book. Revelation 11, I think it's perfect climax for this series. Because this is brilliant. In Revelation 11, two things are going to happen. This is about the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed and a new temple opening up in heaven. And so Revelation 11 is about the transition from an earthly temple to a heavenly temple. And which was, in many prophetic books, was God's intention all along. But he says, measure it. So there's a couple of places in Ezekiel that uses this. All of chapter 40, 41, and 42 of Ezekiel are about measuring the temple. Takes a rod, and this is Ezekiel in Babylon, so he's measuring the future second temple. And so this connects it to the story that we're talking about tonight, which is about the destruction of the second temple. Ezekiel is measuring it out, and he's measuring how wide it is and how long it is. The numbers are very exaggerated, but you can read those for yourself. But the whole idea of go take a rod and measure the temple. And as well, Zechariah, who was a prophet when it was actually going to take place. He was a prophet when Zerubbabel, which means seed of Babylon, he was the descendant of David that was going to come back. We don't think he was ever really quite a king, but he was a governor under the Persians. And he and a priest named Joshua, not any other Joshua, but Joshua, son of Jehozadak, it's a different Joshua. So Zerubbabel and Joshua were the governor and the priest that laid the foundation for the second temple. And so they were very prophetically significant. Ezra talks about him, Nehemiah talks about him, Haggai and Zechariah. They're the prominent figures of that first generation coming back. And so in Revelation 11, he goes back to that, kind of borrows from the language of that day when the temple was going to be built to talk about when the temple's going to be destroyed. And he says, leave out the court which is outside the temple. That's from Ezekiel 42:1. There was the inner court, the Holy of Holies, and there was the holy place, and then there was the court of the women. Don't get mad at me, I didn't create it. And then outside was the court of Gentiles. But he says, leave it out. So Ezekiel 42 says, yeah, leave out the court of the Gentiles, but there's something more. And don't measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. This is what that means. It's one of those little Easter eggs. He's using spiritual language, but he's actually talking about something real. And he says, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So what is the holy city? Anybody want to guess? These are not tricky questions. I'm not trying to trick anybody, get them to say something dumb. Yes, it's Jerusalem. All throughout the Bible, the holy city. There's some other things that are going to explain what he's talking about. So he situates us, even though it's an apocalypse, we're situated right now, measuring out the temple for its final destruction. And we're in the city, and the outer courts of the city and of the temple are given over to Gentiles for 42 months. The 42 months goes back to Daniel, times and half a time, 3.5. And so depending on how you measure it, this is referring in very vague terms to the 3.5 years between 66 AD when Simon beat down the 12th Legion and stole their Aquila, till the final temple was destroyed. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 years. And so it's talking about that season of the war. And so they will tread down the holy city. And so Gentiles are going to tread down the holy city. I'm going to show you something in a moment. It's apocalyptic language, but it's also actually very, very well depicting what happened. And so we don't know how many, but there were somewhere maybe in the neighborhood of 600,000 to 1 million Jews inside the city. And one of the last bastions they took is on the Temple Mount because it had walls around it. And then finally the Romans broke through that and trampled down the temple and burned it to the ground. And so there's part of this prophetic language that's actually being very realistic about what happened. And so it goes on to say, and now it shifts. So that's the beginning. That's the first bookend in Revelation 11 about the temple. All right? What's going to happen is it's measured out for its final destruction, and the Gentiles are going to come and trample it down for 3.5 years. All right? Now we shift to two very mysterious characters, which if you're into Revelation studies, who are the two witnesses? It's a great question. I will give power to my two martyrs. I translated it different. So I've always grown up calling them the two witnesses. The word for witness in Greek is martyrion. It's literally the word martyr, which we think of as somebody that just gives up their life, which is true. A martyr is someone that is burned at the stake or gives up their life for the cause. but it's not necessarily about them being killed. But I call them the two martyrs. And they're a very interesting character. So before you shout out, who do you think the two martyrs are? Don't shout it out, because I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what the theories are too, but where it comes from. These are my two martyrs, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, which is again a reference to time and a half a time, approximately 3.5 years. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands. Now we know what this is because we have the book of Zechariah. Zechariah, remember, he was the prophet that prophesied to Zerubbabel and Joshua that they were going to rebuild the temple. This is the prophet Zechariah. And so who are the two olive trees? Well, he tells us right here. And I asked him, what are these two olive branches beside the two gold pipes that pour out golden oil? So you got to think this is somewhere around 530 BC. So almost 600 years before the book of Revelation. He says, and do you know who these are? No, my Lord, I said. So he said, these are the two who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth. Who were the two during Zechariah's day? We know what their names are. So he doesn't explain it in this verse, but have you ever heard the verse, not by might, not by might nor by power, but what? By my spirit, saith the Lord. The verse before that, it said, go tell Zerubbabel. You didn't know who he was. Zerubbabel was the governor, and Joshua was the high priest that was going to lay the foundation of the temple. Ezra says it like this. He said, then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jehozadak, set out to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And so he's going back. He said, all right, there was two guys. So, by the way, who are the olive branches? They're two leaders of Jerusalem during the laying of the foundation. Metaphorically, they're pictured as olive branches and of two lamps that shoot out, and they're full of oil. So they're anointed to serve and to lead the children. Are you with me? So the parallel is they're two leaders. They're two leaders of the Jewish people in the city of Jerusalem. And so that's going to come back around again. All right. It says, if anyone desires to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. If anyone desires to harm them, he must be killed in this way. And so now here's very curious. Are these good guys or bad guys? Yes. They're very, very interesting because at some point he just called them my martyrs. He called them prophets. So a prophet is a vocal leader. It's not necessarily predicting the future. A prophet is someone that is vocal. They're a preacher. They're somebody to whom people rally around. And it says that fire comes out of their mouth. Now, whatever fire comes out of people's mouth, I don't think this is this is figuratively speaking, like the fire came out of the horse's mouth. But what he's talking about is these two martyrs are leaders. They're the leaders of this season while the temple's being destroyed. But they're also very dangerous. They're not just nice guys, all right? They're also a little dangerous. So they're kind of a two-edged sword. It says in the next verse, by the way, if you go back, fire, one of the characters out of the Old Testament already, there's going to be a couple allusions to the prophet Elijah. And one of them is that Elijah actually could call down fire from out of heaven. And fire would come down. So that's kind of already, we're kind of going, okay, this sounds like Elijah. Well, they have power to shut up the sky, which Elijah also did. You remember that? Whenever King Ahab came to see him, there you are, you troubler of Israel, because he prophesied that it wouldn't rain, and it didn't rain. So this is Elijah, symbolically speaking, this is Elijah, that it may not rain during the days of their prophecy. They have power over the waters to turn them into blood. Who does that sound like? Yes, that's Moses, who prophesied over the water in Egypt when the Israelites were coming up out of Egypt in the Ten Commandments. You ever see that movie? And it turned to blood. So this is Moses and Elijah. And he said, and to strike the earth with every plague as often as they desire. So some end times teachers say, well, that settles it right there. We know who the two witnesses are. They're Moses and Elijah come back from the dead. And it says, all right, so we cannot forget that this is an apocalypse. And so, yes, he's using Moses and Elijah, absolutely. That connection, I think, is pretty solid. But he's not saying that actual Moses and actual Elijah are coming back from the dead. These two leaders are going to be dynamic leaders like Moses and Elijah was and have the ability to cause a lot of destruction, right? All right, so Jesus, just in case you're saying, but Pastor Mike, we should always interpret the Bible literally. But there's a verse in the last verse in the Old Testament says that I'm going to send the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he'll turn the hearts of the children back to the fathers and the hearts of the fathers back to the children. Remember that verse? So still today at a Seder dinner in a Jewish household, they have an empty chair at the end of the table for Elijah to come. So people, time after time, they ask John the Baptist, are you Elijah? And he says, no. And then they ask Jesus, are you Elijah? Are you the Elijah that's supposed to come? There was another prophecy that Moses said, a prophet like me will come. And so when Jesus feeds the 5,000 on the hillside, he was stepping into the role of Moses, feeding the multitude. They asked him, they said, Jesus, isn't Elijah supposed to come? When is Elijah come? And Jesus said this. He said, for the prophets and the law prophesied until John. That's John the Baptist. And he said, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. So just in think you said, the only proper way to read the Bible is to take everything literally, not according to Jesus. He said, if you will accept it, it's not actual Elijah, but it's somebody coming in that same spirit and power of Elijah, right? It says, if you will accept it, when is Elijah coming? He said, he just came. He said, Elijah came and they did to him everything they wanted. John the Baptist was the Elijah that was to come. Are you with me? And so now when we're listening to the book of Revelation, who is this new Moses and Elijah? By the way, it's also a connection in the Transfiguration on the Mount when Jesus is pictured there with Moses and Elijah. So this is that kind of a bringing back of those two prophetic pictures. And so now we've got two connections. Just like in all those apocalypses where you can have double meanings or more than one connection, he's now connected these two earthly leaders in Jerusalem with Zerubbabel and Joshua rebuilding the temple or being a part of the transition of no temple to a temple. So they were the leaders in Jerusalem during a time of transition. And you also have that they were great dynamic leaders like Elijah and Moses. Then he goes on, he says, when they have finished their martyrdom, did somebody say something? I just had an echo in my head. Oh man, it really distracted me. Just happened again. All right, when they have finished their martyrdom or their witnessing, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. A couple of very interesting things. You remember back in chapter 9, what comes up out of the abyss? The angel of the abyss. You remember the angel of the abyss? And the very first time now in the book of Revelation, he uses a different word. He calls him the beast from the abyss. So later on in a couple of chapters, now we're going to talk a lot about the beast. How many of you have ever heard of the beast? Oh, you're going to want to come back in January. Because we're going to talk about the beast. I'm going to tell you what Armageddon is. We're going to talk about the new heavens and the new earth. It's just going to be amazing. Anyway, so the beast, he calls him the beast. It's like he was calling him the angel of the abyss. Now he's calling him the beast out of the abyss. So it connects it, which are both, by the way, referring to the Romans that were coming. And that comes out of the abyss. And he says literally, will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. So my question is, if this is Moses and Elijah come back to life, by the way, they say that because Elijah, went up into the chariot into the sky. But if this is Moses and Elijah, then why does God let him be killed all over again? It just doesn't quite make sense. But I'm getting there. This is kind of like one of those Perry Mason episodes where I'm not going to give you the clue that you need because you could have figured it out if he told you there was a candlestick right next to the nightstand, right? But he's not going to tell you that at the end because Perry Mason's always got to be smarter than you. I'm going to tell you the answer to it. I'm just building up to it. And their dead bodies will be in the street of the great city. What's the great city? Yeah, Psalm 48 says the city is Mount Zion, the city of the great God, which is spiritually called Sodom. So you remember Sodom and Gomorrah during the time of Abraham and Lot was the sinful city down at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, fire and brimstone. And so while Sodom was being destroyed, God rescued Lot and his family, except for his wife who turned back and turned into a pillar of salt. So why is Jerusalem like Sodom? Because Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and the wise are going to get out of the city. And he says it's also spiritually called, by the way, did I imagine it or did he just say, I'm using spiritual language? Spiritually, it's called. He just said right in the text, you need to interpret what I'm telling you in a spiritual sense, not in a this is actually Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's also Egypt. How was Jerusalem like Egypt? Because Jerusalem had the plagues come down upon them while the children of Israel were getting out. Jesus said in his Olivet discourse and talking about the end times, he said, pray that it doesn't come in winter and pray that you're not pregnant at the time. But he says, but if you're in the city, when you see troops surrounding Jerusalem, get out of the city. You remember that? Everybody says, oh, that must be metaphorical when he's saying all that because, that has to do with the end times and we don't live in the city. And so the craziest thing is we'll look right at something Jesus said. He's told us point blank, what I'm talking about is the destruction of Jerusalem. Get out. And they did. And so he says, we take things that are figurative to be literal, and we take things that are literal to be figurative. And so I think this part, he says, it's spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. You get the metaphor for it? Where also, what's it say? Where was Jesus crucified? What city? Was he crucified in Rome? Multiple choice. Or was he crucified in Jerusalem? All right. And yet still people read this and say, it can't be about that. That part's metaphorical. No, it's not. The city where their Lord was crucified was Jerusalem. That's what this whole chapter is about. A conflict that's happening in Jerusalem during the life, during the generation of the audience, which was the early church in Asia Minor. Not all of them, but undoubtedly some of them that were reading that book had seen the destruction of Jerusalem. So just to skip ahead too, not everything in the whole book of Revelation is about the war with the Jews. There are predictions of things that weren't fulfilled at the time of its writing. But especially right now, we are at this crux, we are at this moment when we're talking about a very real thing that happened. From among the peoples, tribes, and languages and nations, people will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days and will not allow their dead bodies to be laid in a tomb. So there's places in Psalm 79 and Jeremiah 25 that talk about in the first destruction of Jerusalem how the dead bodies were just laid there in the middle of a siege. And trust me, if you ever read Josephus, there were many, many, many different scenes that could be depicted by thousands of people laying in the streets. And so this is not a stretch by any means. Those who dwell upon the land, here's one of those tricky places that's going to come back, that most English translation says those who dwell upon the earth. So I only translated earth when it's contrasting the heavens and the earth, the two different realms, the spiritual realm and the earthly realm. But what I think, a lot of times it should just be translated as land because it has to do with the land of Israel and their loss of the land. Those who dwell upon the land rejoice over them, and they will be glad. Why would they be glad over Moses and Elijah being killed again? It's because they're evil, I guess. But why would the whole land be glad if it was Moses and Elijah? Who are these guys? And they will give gifts to one another because these two prophets tormented those who dwell upon the land. Can anybody imagine Moses and Elijah coming back and tormenting people? Doesn't make sense. So who is it? Who is it? I'm being Perry Mason right now. I want to show you. Is the video next? Yes, it is. I want to watch a little video, can I? I was going to make a moving map video. I found a couple, that are just absolutely brilliant on YouTube, already there. Now, this guy pronounces some of the names a little wrong. I want to correct him. And he also talks a little slow for my taste. But this is about 10 minutes. And I just want to show you a visual depiction of what it was like. By the way, it's going to go back and cover some of what I've already covered. The siege in Galilee and how Israel became occupied by Romans. And I want you to ask this question: who were the two leaders during this great conflict when the temple was destroyed? What two characters could be in the role of the leaders of the Jews in Jerusalem against the Romans, whom the Romans come and make war on and kill them? Who could it be? Anybody know their names? Well, you will in a minute. Watch this.
The siege of Jerusalem was a massive military endeavor, the likes of which had not been seen since the fall of Carthage 2 centuries earlier. Starting in April of 70 AD and lasting nearly 5 months, the battle would be a brutal, no-holds-barred brawl fought over every inch of the city. At stake was the success of the Great Revolt in Judea and the survival of the Jewish people. Roman involvement in Judea first began in 63 BC when Pompey the Great was drawn into a Jewish civil war and eventually seized Jerusalem. However, the region saw much turbulence during the final years of the Republic and was taken over by the Parthians before legions returned to install the puppet King Herod. Eventually, a series of procurators oversaw Judea, but these largely lacked the competency or military power to impose order. Roman authority was highly dependent on local elites who themselves often lacked the confidence or respect of the Jewish people. On top of this, the population of Judea was divided across lines of class, ethnic, and religious divisions. As a result, the region was highly unstable. Revolutions seemed perpetually around the corner. In May of 66 AD, rioting amongst the people was met by the heavy-handed overreaction of the Roman procurator Florus, who only further incensed the situation by plundering southwest Jerusalem and killing 3,600 people. As the situation escalated, reinforcements soon arrived from Caesarea, only to be driven out by a rebellion that now spread to the entire region. Jerusalem was taken by Jewish rebels, while Roman strongholds were eliminated in Judea and Perea. Roman efforts to combat the uprising were led by Vespasian and his son Titus, under orders from the Emperor Nero. The campaign season of 67 AD saw Vespasian advance south from Antioch and focus his efforts on subduing Galilee. Field battles were virtually unheard of, given the huge advantage the Romans held, and most of the fighting was concentrated around fortifications. This resulted in particularly brutal treatment of any populations which did not submit immediately. Rome often acted particularly strict to make a point. During the 68 AD offensive in Judea, for instance, cities downstream of the Roman army learned of their approach not by messengers, but by the arrival of bodies floating down the Jordan River. The campaign ground to a halt with the news of Nero's death. The anarchy that followed was known as the Year of Four Emperors and included a bid for power by Vespasian on July 1st, 69 AD. By the summer of 70 AD, he had come out the victor and set sail for Rome to claim his prize. Titus was left in command of the Judean campaign with instructions to put an end to the Jewish uprising. This, of course, meant the long-delayed assault on Jerusalem, home to the rebel leaders and the heart of the resistance. Titus began the Jerusalem campaign in the spring of 70 AD. His army of 4 legions was assembled in Alexandria and marched north to Caesarea along the shoreline. Supporting his force were 23 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 8 alai of cavalry, and numerous detachments of local troops provided by the region's client rulers. Historical records seem to claim that this force numbered around 60,000 men. These estimates imply that the core legionary troops made up around 35% of the army, the auxiliary troops about 32%, and the remaining local forces about 33%. Such a high proportion of local troops does raise some doubts on the accuracy of our sources. However, we may speculate that local rulers were eager to donate men to the war effort in a political bid to secure Rome's goodwill amidst a bloody revolt. The Roman commanders themselves may also have been eager to have additional troops at their side. While the local forces were surely not as reliable as the crack legionaries, they could take on many responsibilities of the army and thus free up the elite troops to do what they did best. This would be especially important in the upcoming siege of a city as large and well fortified as Jerusalem. The Roman forces approached Jerusalem in separate marching columns due to the security and supply constraints of the Judean hill country. Titus led both the 12th and 15th legions by the most direct road, while the 5th Macedonica approached via Emmaus, and the 10th Fretensis approached via Jericho. On April 23rd, the lead units of the 12th and 15th legions arrived on the hills to the north of the city. That night, the 5th Macedonica arrived, and by morning, the rest of the army entered the battlefield. Before them lay the great city with gleaming temples and stout battlements. The city of Jerusalem is surrounded on three sides by steep ravines. To the east lies the Kidron Valley, to the west the Gihon Valley, and sweeping around the south is the Hinnom Valley. A series of hills surround the area, including the famed Mount of Olives to the east. Ancient Jerusalem itself was built atop several key topographic features. The city incorporated two spurs of land with the Tyropaean Valley in between. Atop the eastern spur stood the Temple Mount and the Antonia Fortress. The heights of the western spur were occupied by the elites who had built the upper city during the Hashmonean and Herodian periods. In the middle of these two areas sprawled the more ancient and crowded lower city, which held most of the population. Both the upper and lower cities were enclosed by a wall, which was anchored on the flank by the massive fortifications around the Temple Mount. Inevitably, the population outgrew its bounds, and the second city was developed north of the first wall. This exposed position was soon surrounded by a second wall, which ran from the Antonia in the east to the Genath Gate in the west. By the 1st century AD, yet another suburb had sprung up to the north, known as the New City. Once again, expansion necessitated fortifications, and in 41 AD, Herod Agrippa commissioned the construction of the third wall. This was an ambitious project with massive stone blocks meant to enclose a large area. It seems that the scale of the defensive works raised some suspicion amongst the Romans, who forced their client king to abandon the project before its completion. Over the course of the Jewish revolt, however, the people of Jerusalem managed to put the finishing touches on their third layer of battlements. By the time the legions arrived outside Jerusalem, the walls had been raised an additional 9 meters, and a series of square towers were built projecting outwards. The combination of tough terrain and stout walls made for a formidable 3-layered defensive network. Additionally, the maze of narrow streets between the fortifications could be easily blockaded, while numerous underground water and sewage passages meant that defenders could emerge from any direction for a surprise attack on intruders. Bunkered within this massive, fortified city was a garrison of approximately 20,000 Jewish troops. However, these were not professional forces. Rather, they were a motley assortment of militiamen, refugees, and zealots. This composition is a reflection of the thoroughly fractured nature of the Jewish resistance. Since the outbreak of the revolt, an effective, centralized government had failed to take form, and the resistance suffered from a chronic failure to synergize its various factions. Jerusalem had been divided along party lines and was tearing itself apart in bloody political infighting right up until the arrival of Roman forces. The principal leaders were Simon Giores, who laid claim to the upper city, and John of Gischala, who was based out of the Temple Mount. Simon led the larger of the two forces, which included 10,000 men under 50 officers and 6,000 allied Idumeans under 8 commanders. These troops garrisoned the first wall from the Kidron all the way to the Palace of the Kings. On the other side of the city, John had an armed following of around 6,000 men under 20 officers and was joined by Eleazar with his 2,400 zealots. These forces held the Temple Mount, along with the surrounding neighborhoods including the Ophel and the Tyropaean Valley. Traditional Jewish fighters were lightly armed and armored. They fought at range with slings, bows, and javelins, before closing in with spears, swords, and clubs. While agile and determined, they often stood no chance in a straight-up engagement against Roman forces.
Oh, you turned the lights back on. I thought I ended it right there. Did you hear him? All right. Without the book of Josephus, there's no way of knowing who in the world are these two olive branches and stuff, but there are whole chapters, a whole section. In fact, from the first part of the Galilean campaign till when Vespasian finally becomes, it's Vespasian, by the way, not Vespasian, and it's not a Caesarean section, it's Caesarea, and it's John of Gishgala and Simon Bar Georgas. Anyway, that means son of Georgas. By the way, I made a mistake last week. Did you catch it? So you didn't, but I'm honest. John of Gishgala was from Gishgala. Simon Bar Georgas was not from, I said he was from Gadara, when Gadara got stuff. It's not, he was from a different place that started with a G. Anyway, just a mistake I had last week. I just thought I'd tell you, because you didn't catch it. But these were the two leaders. This was the, like if I was to say, two leaders and I'm describing the Civil War, you would know who General Grant was, right? You would know who was from the South? General Lee. You'd know Grant and Lee, right? The Grant and Lee of the Jewish war. So the horrible thing about it was, now the Romans are coming down, but they're in the middle of the city fighting each other. And so at first there were zealots. There was about 20 of them. Eleazar was that, and we get the word zealot, like you talk about being zealous, or a zealot is like a radical, right? That was the name of their faction, is the zealots. And they took over the Temple Mount, and they killed the two high priests. And so that was the first stage of it. And then they invited Simon to come in to try to quell them. And Simon was brutal too. They wouldn't let him in and out. And then finally, John of Gishgala kind of joined in with the zealots, and he brought all of his troops on the Temple Mount and the lower part of the city. And when Simon came in, they couldn't get him out. He was catching people outside of the city and beheading them and killing them. And so they kidnapped his wife. And he got even more brutal. And then they hired some Idumeans, which are people from the south, to come in and try to get them out. Anyway, by the time it was over, you had Simon and all of his troops and the Idumeans on one side of the city. And you have John of Gishgala and the zealots on the upper Temple Mount. And Josephus said they had enough grain in the city to last a siege of many, many years. But they started fighting each other and they burned all their grain supplies. And they killed one another. And it was and then by the time the Romans finally came down, on some occasions, I'll show you a little bit more of these. I'm not going to show you more than like 10 minutes. But there's some other little scenes of how actually the siege took place, because we have details, more than a lot of details of recent wars. Josephus was a general, and he recorded every last detail and what was broken here, and the good and the bad, and the mistakes and the failures and defeats of both the Romans and the Jews as they fought their way through the city, eventually taking over the Temple Mount, burning it down, and wiping out the whole city. And eventually John and Simon were taken in chains back to Rome. And so questions about any of this. So remember I said it's an impressionism? So are you saying that Simon and John are that they're Moses and Elijah? No, not exactly. No, it's not like that. It's an impression of those things. They were the leaders of Jerusalem when the temple was being destroyed. They were the two generals, and they were mixed. Remember it said everybody celebrated because they had tormented the people of the land. It was definitely mixed. They were the champions of the Jewish people against the Romans, but they were also very treacherous and mean and nasty to the other factions. And so it's a mixed thing. So it fits better than any other kind of impressionistic thing, that we're just kind of talking about the two leaders that were there and that eventually didn't last long. Yeah. Questions? Can we just keep going? All right. What are their names? Simon and John. Right. You don't have to remember the rest of it. So Josephus says this. Oh, and by the way, did I read the part where they come back to life? And then there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. And 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe comes quickly. Did I read that part about it in Revelation? Oh, yeah, I did. After the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered into them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear seized all those who saw them. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up into heaven in the cloud, and their enemies saw them. So that phrase is, by the way, in the chapter 4, when he says to John, "Come up here," and he's translated into heaven. And my friends that are talking about the rapture, I was asked to write a paper in Bible college. Where does the rapture have in the book of Revelation? And it's just right there, that phrase. And so, say he's talking about, but there's another allusion, what he's talking about, them being translated, is that's what happened to Elijah at the end. What happened to Simon John, we know. One of them was in prison for the rest of his life, and the other one, they threw him off of a building and killed him. But they paraded him back. And so here they were this really big deal, right? They were the leaders of the Civil War. And then all of a sudden, they're just gone. They're just gone. And that part is over. Except something really weird. It says that life came back into it and the people were astonished. There's a really weird story that I can't get out of my head. And Josephus says, and now Simon, that's Simon Bar-Georges, he was the more vicious of the two. He had the most soldiers. He was over the upper city. And now Simon, thinking that he might be able to astonish and elude the Romans, put on a white frock and buttoned up on him a purple cloak and appeared out of the ground in the place where the temple had formerly been. So a lot of them had hidden in underground caverns. And so he puts on his kingly garb, because he wanted to be the king. Both John and Simon wanted to be the king. And he puts on this purple robe, and he all of a sudden appears out of the ashes where the temple was. Like, ta-da! And people were astonished, like you would be. I thought he was dead. And at first, indeed, those who saw him were greatly astonished and stood there where they were. But afterward, they came nearer to him and asked him who he was. Now, Simon would not tell him, but he bid them call for their captain. And when they ran to call him, Terentius Rufus, who was left to command the army there, came to Simon and learned of him the whole truth and kept him in bonds and let Caesar know that he was taken. That's Titus. Thus did God bring this man to be punished for what bitter and savage tyranny he had exercised against his countrymen by those who were his worst enemies. And so you have from Josephus the mixed history of these guys. It's not only were they the revolutionary leaders, but they were also tyrannical rulers that have a mixed history. Left a little bit of an impression. Should I move on? And that day there was a great earthquake. I already read this part. He said, and then the seventh angel sounded, and a great voices in heaven followed. Oh, by the way, I got to go back to this one. In verse 14, it says, the second woe is past. Behold, the third woe comes quickly. The first woe was the coming of Vespasian to destroy the northern campaign in Galilee. And the second woe was the destruction of the temple and the two leaders that got defeated there. And then the scene shifts, and the seventh angel sounded, and great voices in heaven followed, saying, the kingdom of the world. Friends, listen, this is one of the climaxes of the whole book of Revelation. He said, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. So what we have is the end of Old Testament Judaism and the birth of the church. And now Jesus, who's the one true king, has now come and he's begun to reign. So his kingdom is coming to reign through his people. And that was the conclusion, by the way, of Augustine when he wrote the book, The City of God. He said, this isn't about the defeat of the Romans or the victory of the Romans under Constantine. This is about the ending of the old system and the birth of the church and the rule of Christ. And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God's throne, the 24 elders are the 12 patriarchs plus the 12 apostles. We find that out later. I think in chapter 18 or 19, it actually tells us who they are. They fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, we give thanks, Lord God, the Almighty, the one who is and who was, because you have taken your great power and reigned. And then the nations were angry. That's like a quote from Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage? And your wrath has come, as did the time for the dead to be judged. And so in the book of Daniel is one of the few times it predicts that there's going to be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. There's going to be a judgment at the end. And to give to your bondservants, the prophets, their reward, as well as to the saints and those who fear your name, the small and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. In Daniel 7:27, it gives something similar. Daniel is about the transition from the Seleucids to the kingdom of Israel, to hand off to the Hasmonean kingdom, which happened about 140 BC. And in Daniel's handoff, he said, the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole sky shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. That's Daniel's apocalypse. John's apocalypse says that same kind of transition is now happening for the early church. Now God has given you the keys. Now he's going to rule through his Messiah, through his Christ, and it's going to be a spiritual kingdom, and he's going to rule through you. He's not going to live in an earthly temple because the earthly temple's now gone, but he's going to live in you. Do you remember what Paul said? Know ye not that you are the temple of the Holy Spirit? Where does God's Spirit dwell now? Does he dwell in a building? Do you think he's sad about that? I think he's like, man, when are they going to build me another temple so I can live inside a brick building? He's not saying that. He lives in every single one of us, and he goes wherever we go. How many are with me so far? This is part of the core of the message of the book of Revelation, by the way, is that the old temple's gone. Stop crying over it. Because there was some of that generation that still, man, how can we be followers of God when the temple is destroyed and when there's no more high priest or sacrifices? The book of Revelation is written to that early church that says you don't need any of that stuff. It was actually a part of God's big picture that the Romans came and destroyed it once and for all. And now he lives on in you. That's why I think it's a mistake to separate those 7 messages to the churches in the book of Revelation from the rest of the story, because they're integral to it. The message to those 7 churches was God's Spirit doesn't live in a temple anymore. He lives in you. The temple's gone. Everybody with me? How many know that the Holy Spirit lives in us? He lives in us. So I've never understood it, not even since I was a kid. People say, no, they got to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem so Jesus can. I say, why? Why would we go backwards? The very thing Jesus said, I can tear down this temple in 3 days. He said not one stone will be left on a stone of this temple. What's really cool is in 97, when I went to Israel, to the right of the temple of the western wall, which is the outer wall of the courtyard that you just said. And some of those stones are as old as the first temple. And to the right of it was just this flat area. When I went back in 2007, they had excavated like 25 feet down along that area, down to the street level of Jesus' time. And Jesus says, see these stones? Not one will be left on another. And they found giant stones that were a part of the second temple, thrown down off the upper and caved in the street down below. And you can see the landing spot of them in the rocks in a big pile. I think that's amazing. It's really cool. You get to see, wow, that's the actual temple that the Romans tore down. And so this is the transition. And then it says, now listen very carefully, and God's temple that is in heaven was opened, and the ark of the Lord's covenant was seen in his temple. Lightning, sounds, thunders, and earthquake, and great hail followed. Those things are all those things are all symbols. The lightning and the hail, the thunders and stuff. The elements of the earth are proclaiming that there's a complete cataclysmic shift in human government on the earth. Nothing's ever going to be the same. This is a whole change and transition. But notice what Revelation has. At the beginning, we have the destruction of the first temple, and we have the opening of the temple in heaven. It's a new day. It's a new day. And now the kingdom of the world is the kingdom of our Christ, is the kingdom of the Messiah. So what do we do with that? So how are we bringing God's kingdom into the world? How are we reaching out? And, it's up to us. He lives in us now. He doesn't live in a temple in Jerusalem. Yeah? Thoughts, questions? I love it. You just accept everything that I said like this. I used to have could you bring Kevin a microphone? I used to have a physics teacher that was kind of a smart aleck, and he'd ask us questions, and we never had any questions. He'd tell us something like that, and he goes, any questions? And we just he used to say, man, Hitler would have loved you guys. because we never ask questions. Anyway, I wouldn't say that about you people. What? Go ahead.
So I'm still kind of stuck back when you talked about Simon, the Roman general who dressed in purple.
Simon wasn't a Roman general. No, Simon was one of the rebel Jewish leaders.
But he's the one that dressed in purple that rose up?
Yep.
Oh, no, he was a Roman.
Both Simon Bar Georgis and John of Gishgala saw themselves as self-proclaimed king of the Jews. Just what they had nailed over Jesus' head, right? But they thought they were going to be the king of Jerusalem. And so, yeah, he was kind of Baghdad Bob at that point. The Romans had destroyed everybody and they were hiding in caves, and he just thought he'd go out with a blaze of glory, so he dressed up like a king and then appeared up out of the ground where the temple was.
So
Little delusional, perhaps? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why they arrested him. I think, why are they arresting a Roman general? But okay.
No, he wasn't Roman. He was Jewish. He was the leader of the one faction of, I call them revolutionaries or rebels, but Josephus calls them the seditious. The seditious, that's what he called them. I don't know if that was their actual title or that's just the name. And I don't know what the word is in Greek. I didn't look it up. He had some nickname for them. He called them the seditious, and he called the other group the zealots. And they spent as much time fighting each other and burning each other's food supplies as they did fighting the Romans. So much so that Vespasian, when he found out that they were fighting each other, his general said, let's go attack them right now. He goes, why? Because let them kill themselves, you know. Never, like Napoleon said, never interrupt your enemy when he's destroying himself. So it was really sad. And it's true, Josephus is not a friendly historian to the Jews. He had defected over to the Romans and been set free. And when Vespasian went back to become emperor, he set Josephus free and gave him the name Flavius Josephus, gave him his family name. So he was a bit critical, but yeah, he was not. Simon and John, who were the two leaders of the rebellion against, they have a mixed history. They were the heroes in some cases. They were definitely the rebel leaders that went out and fought. On some of the skirmishes, they actually even fought together, believe it or not. One of the first sallies out of the city to go attack the Romans, I think it was the 10th Legion that was on the Mount of Olives. We'll get to that later. But yeah, Simon and John were the two guys that headed it all up in a failed cause. Does that make sense now? Simon and John were both Jewish rebels. They were the leaders of the rebellion that lost. No relation to any of the disciples. This is like 70 AD. No relation. Simon and John and Jesus, by the way, were very, very common names. Very common names. There were lots. We don't know. We only think of the one Jesus. But Simon, Shimon is actually what it is in Hebrew. And John, they were very, very common names. Yeah. So was Mary, by the way. You ever notice how many Marys there are in the Bible? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Great. Thank you, Michael.
So I was wondering about Josephus. Did he have anything to say about the wealth of the temple or the Ark of the Covenant? Anything taken away? Or
Yes.
Okay.
There was enormous wealth. In fact, there was so much wealth taken out that the price of gold and silver dropped by like a half after they looted the temple. But the Ark of the Covenant, that's a curious question. So it says the Ark of the Covenant, and now this is talking about the heavenly temple.
Yeah.
So the Ark of the Covenant, so far as we know, disappeared with the Babylonians. In 586 BC, when they destroyed the first temple, they took the Ark of the Covenant into Babylon, never to be heard of again. Now there's rumors later on, the Ethiopians, there's about 10 places in Ethiopia that claim to have it in the basement.
Yeah.
And that from the Queen of Sheba that married, it's not true. It's just a myth, but it's a part of their national myth that they've got the original Ark. It's not in some cave in Egypt where Indiana Jones can find it. It went into Babylon. So that means in the second temple, there never was an Ark. There was no Ark of the Covenant in the second temple. And so that was a part of it. And if you were to ask some of the prophets, like the monks that lived down in Qumran that had the Dead Sea Scrolls, in a lot of their writings, they claimed that the glory of the Lord never returned to that second temple. So they never even were. They claimed that the high priesthood was illegitimate, and that that second temple was just a fixture. The original was built, and then King Herod the Great built onto it even more, and then Agrippa decorated it, and it was kind of a propaganda tool. And the high priests that were up there, they were not like holy people. They were government employees under the Romans. They were appointed by the Romans, and so, yeah, it was. So there was no Ark of the Covenant. So what John is picturing is here in the new heavenly Jerusalem, the ark is there again. Okay. The Ark of the Covenant has been restored, and there is a great deal. There's also one other place. It's when Titus was the general. When he returned back to Rome, they had huge celebrations. It was huge. It was one of the greatest celebrations for any Roman war that was fought not against an enemy, but against one of their own provinces. So the Jewish war, really, we call it the Jewish revolt because it was like the United States invading Georgia. It was one of their provinces. And so Vespasian became emperor. Titus, his son, was going to become emperor too. But when they got back, they had a huge celebration, and they built this huge thing that is still there in Rome called the Arch of Titus. And it has depictions of them winning this war, and part of the depictions of these Roman soldiers carrying the huge 7-branched menorah out of the temple. So there's a stone relief picture of them looting that menorah. And what looks like a table, so probably the table of showbread. And so, yeah, they looted that temple and took all of the money, and it was a disaster. It was a disaster, yeah.
Was the treasures in the temple one of the main goals of the Romans to go in there because they knew that was in there?
No, because they kind of had access to it anyway. So the one guy that Cestius Gallus, the guy in 66 that came down and came in there, so the procurators that were in charge of Jerusalem, they would loot the temple from time to time and take out taxes. Yeah, the Romans were basically in charge. They could loot the temple anytime they wanted to. And the high priests who ruled it were they were the Sadducees, and they were more political than religious. The Pharisees were more religious people. The Sadducees were just like puppet senators. And so they were the rich elite of the city. What's that? There were a lot of taxes, and several of you remember the tax that Luke mentions in the Jesus narrative when he's born? That tax was in like 6 AD, and it caused a huge revolt. So overtaxation was a major result. I just started watching, there's a new Ken Burns documentary on the Revolutionary War. Have you seen it? Just watching it last night. But taxation was like one of the major causes of it. But it wasn't really money that the Roman Empire at this point during this war had unlimited resources. They literally, a lot of the 12th Legion got wiped out. By the time they attacked Jerusalem again to tear it down, the 12th was completely restocked and resupplied with people. And yeah, in the next section when we talk, I might go back and talk a little bit in detail on how Vespasian became emperor and kind of all those politics, and how tight they were with Herod Agrippa, who was like third generation now from Herod the Great, who was a client king. And they were very, very close to Rome. Agrippa II was basically raised by Emperor Claudius in Rome along with Nero. They were like college buddies. They were family. So remember, Judea was a client state, and so all of that land. And so could you imagine being a hardcore, like the Zealots? They were hardcore loyalists to Israel, and they were being sold out by their high priests. They were being taken advantage of and taxed by the Herods, who were client kings. They were supposedly descended from Jewish roots, but they were sellouts. They were puppets. And so a lot of those auxiliaries were supplied by Herod against his own people. And so they had every reason to rebel, but they couldn't all agree about, it was like by the time they got in there were Shiite Jews and just forgot, Sunnis. They had different factions, and they did not like each other. And John of Giscala actually beforehand was a rival of Josephus up in Galilee before the Romans came, so he didn't like him at all. Great questions, you guys. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
The intricate stones at the Wailing Wall.
Yeah.
Were they foundation of one of the temples?
Yeah. Well, so the Temple Mount is a large rectangle, and then the temple sits in the middle, facing east. That map that they showed is kind of skewed to the side. You're looking from the east onto it, but the Temple Mount is the whole courtyard that's raised, and so there's one section of that outer wall that they have made into a kind of a little park where you can go and visit. You can walk right up to that. So because the Muslims have occupied still to this day the Temple Mount, where they built the Dome of the Rock, a typical Orthodox Jew will not go up onto the Temple Mount. Some do, just depends on what your viewpoint is. They won't go up on that because they consider it desecrated. So the closest they can get to where the old temple was is that wall. They call it the Western Wall. Some people call it the Wailing Wall because people go there and pray. And the lowest stones, the largest ones, are very old. And then there's some that are from like later on, and then the top ones are from the Turkish Empire era. And so, yeah, some of the oldest ones go back to Jesus' time and even older. But not of the temple, but that's just the temple, the wall that surrounded the Temple Mount. I hope you all come with me when the war breaks and we can go back to Israel, because I like to just show you all this stuff. It's really cool to see it in person. Yeah, that's great. And they're not really that decorative. They're carved stones. People put little prayers in between the cracks of it and pray. I went and prayed on it. I thought I'd have this really religious experience. Put my hand on it. You know what it felt like? Big rock. I almost felt like God was saying, Mike, what are you doing? I live in here. I don't live in this place, right? But yeah, we got a rock in our own church, right? Yeah, we can go feel that rock. But I still, to this, it never made sense to me. It seems like the progression of the scripture was that the temple is gone and now we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so why would we go back? I don't know. And I think that's just people reading those stories that talk about the temple standing. And they said, well, if this is about the future, that must mean the temple is rebuilt, instead of connecting it to what the story was actually about. Kevin has another one? All right, go.
So I don't know if this is what he was alluding to, but you said when you went back to Jerusalem and they had excavated deeper, they had thrown stones over, or what were those stones from? Were those from the Temple Mount?
Yeah.
Or they were from someplace else?
No, that's from up on the temple. That's the assumption, is that those were the stones, some of the stones from the temple that got thrown down onto the city street. Sorry again, what?
The mount part or the actual temple?
Some of those stones are probably the actual temple. I don't know. Just telling you what I was told. But they found stones down there, and the streets, the big part is the stone streets were caved in, which would have been from the concussion of those. And all around were ritual bath stations so that they could have bathed and gotten ready to go up on the Temple Mount and worship. Just amazing. So very, very impactful. A lot of the book of Revelation, part of the core is dealing with the grief of having been crushed by the Romans and their temple torn down and their priesthood ended. And now where do we go? And the message of the gospel of the book of Revelation is that you don't need those things anymore. Those things are done and over with. That day is past. The church doesn't need a temple and doesn't need a high priest, because Jesus is our high priest. So anyway, I hope you're encouraged. I hope you come back in January. We'll finish up the rest. There's still some really awesome stuff at the end of the book of Revelation. You got to come back and at least find out who the beast is or the mark of the beast. No, it's not your COVID shot. It's not your COVID shot. Get the shot or don't. It's not the mark of the beast. Anyway, all right. Lord bless you. Thank you for coming. My pleasure.